Welcome to the IISS this afternoon. My name is Rahul Roy Chaudhary. I am the Senior Fellow for South Asia at the Institute. I'm delighted today to welcome Philip Barton as a colleague and as a consulting Senior Fellow at the IISS. Philip is currently on secondment from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and served for 2 years till 4 months ago as the British High Commissioner in Pakistan. As some of you are aware, the British High Commission in Pakistan is the UK's single largest diplomatic mission overseas. And before Pakistan, Philip was the Deputy British Ambassador to the US and has spent 3 years at Number 10 as Private Secretary to Prime Ministers John Major and Tony Blair. Today, Philip will be speaking on his personal perspective on Pakistan, reflecting on key economic, political and security issues. Philip, over to you.
Thank you very much, Raoul, and thank you very much, everybody, for coming along this lunchtime to listen to me. As Raoul said, I'm here at IISS as a Senior Consulting Fellow for the next 9 months. I'm doing so on secondment from the Foreign Office, but I'm going to be speaking today in a personal capacity rather than as a representative of the UK government. I'm also going to be speaking, I hope, as a friend of Pakistan, but not as an uncritical one. As Raoul said, I finished as High Commissioner in February, having spent a little over 2 years in Islamabad. But I have a long relationship with the country, and what I'm going to say, I think, is hopefully going to reflect a little bit of that perspective. I first visited more than 20 years ago when I was posted in our High Commission in New Delhi, and looking back then, and it was a short trip in 1995, I remember 3 things which with hindsight have stuck in my mind. Firstly, the similarities between Delhi and Lahore, and particularly the older parts of those cities, reflecting the kind of shared history of South Asia. Secondly, that in those days, and this is something that's changed, as is my third point, secondly, that Pakistan was visibly more developed than India in those days. The infrastructure was better, the cars on the road were more varied and frankly more expensive, and that's no longer true. And thirdly, I remember in 1995 going to Peshawar on my own, walking around the market, buying a couple of carpets and having a very nice, friendly time. Although it was unusual for a British eye that everyone had a gun on their shoulder, it was a completely safe city. And although as High Commissioner I was able to visit Peshawar on more than one occasion, I could only do so with quite elaborate security arrangements. Since then I've worked closely on Pakistan issues since the country returned to democracy in 2008. I was Director in the Foreign Office in charge of our relationship with South Asia, and then in the Cabinet Office coordinating our policies to Afghanistan, towards Afghanistan and Pakistan at the height of our effort in Afghanistan, before then going on to be High Commissioner. I've had 4 months to step back from my time in Islamabad to reflect and gain a bit of perspective. When I left the country, I left with a little bit of optimism about the future there, and I haven't changed my mind. But coming back here has brought home to me 2 things, I think, which I hope to illustrate. Firstly, I think there is a gap now between perceptions of Pakistan and the reality in the country, even in a place like the UK, which knows it reasonably well. And secondly, though, the scale of the challenges facing the country really are very significant, not least the battle for perception around the world. What I thought I'd do today is set out why I think there's a more positive trajectory in 4 areas: democracy, security, the economy and regional relationships, and then describe a little bit what I think are the biggest challenges the country faces going forward, before giving you a chance to ask me some questions. So if I take each of those 4 areas in turn, democracy, so there were elections in 2008 and then again in 2013, the first time the country had a full transition in terms of a government reaching its conclusion. In our view, the elections in 2013, while not perfect, were better than the ones in 2008 and did reflect broadly the will of the Pakistani people in terms of the outcome. But we then went on to see in 2014 a degree of political turmoil, and it was a difficult year for Pakistani democracy, if we're honest. But I think out of it, actually, the democracy in the country came out strengthened for two reasons. Firstly, and crucially, with the exception of PTI, who were out on the streets trying to bring about a change of government through street protest, all the other main political parties stood behind Nawaz Sharif and the PMLN, not because they supported particularly him and his party's policies, but actually because they didn't want to see a change of government brought about through unconstitutional means. And that is not how similar situations played out in the 90s, and I think that is a key difference. And secondly, and equally crucially, under the Chief of Army Staff, Raheel Sharif, the military stayed out of the political fray, and they did not intervene to bring about a change of government. And again, I think those two things say to me that actually democracy in Pakistan has become deeper and stronger. Since then, there have been local elections across the country in all of the provinces, which I think is important in a country the size of Pakistan. There's an opportunity to make the electoral system better between now and the next elections in 2018. And I think over time we will see improvements. And I think the country is beginning to move towards a point, which is what you want to see in democracy, where crucially the losers accept the outcome. I mean, that for me is the key test, that on the day after a ballot, those who haven't won power actually accept the outcome, go into opposition and let the government get on with governing as per their mandate. So I think democracy is step by step getting stronger. Secondly, on the security side, again, I think there's been a significant change for the better. Pakistan has gone through a very difficult period with very high levels of terrorist violence across the country. But at the beginning of 2015, in the wake of a terrible tragedy, the attack on the Army Public School in Peshawar, I think there is now a new, and there was then, a new determination across the country to try to get to grips with this problem in a more fundamental way. Now, military operations had already started in the tribal areas at that point in Operation Zarb-e-Azb, and I'm very conscious that Colonel Zulfikar from the Pakistan High Commission is giving a talk here next week on that operation, so I won't steal his thunder and go into detail on the military aspects of it. But I think the points I would make is, firstly, the operation wasn't just in the tribal areas. There was a concerted effort across Pakistan, particularly in the cities, to improve security. So a big effort in Karachi, which has had an impact. And secondly, if you look at the statistics, they're really quite striking. So in 2015, 48% fall across the country in the number of terrorist attacks, 38% fall in the number of deaths from terrorism. And if you talk to businessmen based in Karachi, they will say that their day-to-day lives and the ability for them to go about their business, which I think is important given the concentration of the country's economic and financial effort in that city, is transformed by the improved security. So while I wouldn't say and claim that security is fantastic across the country and the problem is solved, and there's clearly been some terrible attacks this year, notably in Lahore at Easter, and there are also, I think, some very legitimate questions one can ask about the ability of groups to use Pakistan as a base to operate in other countries, in Pakistan's neighbours. Security has improved significantly, and my sense is there is much more of a consensus now that is the biggest security challenge to the country, that there needs to be a concerted civilian and military effort to tackle it, and that actually those groups that do pose a threat to Pakistan's neighbours from within Pakistan aren't in fact in the country's best interest. Although again, I wouldn't say that is an absolute view held by everybody, and that clearly is still a problem in terms of Pakistan's regional relationships. But security is definitely better. Thirdly, the economy. When Nawaz Sharif's government came in 2013, I think the reserves were down to 3 weeks' worth of the cost of imports. They were on the brink of a genuine balance of payments crisis. Actually now, 3 years on, the economy has stabilised. They have avoided that crisis. Growth, while not yet high enough, is up to 4.5%. They had last month the 11th review of their IMF programme, and they will have the 12th and final one in August of this year, which will lead almost certainly to Pakistan completing an IMF programme for only the second time in 16 starts. And while one can say that, particularly if you look at the programme agreed in 2008, immediately after the return to democracy, that was a very soft programme with very, very low conditionality, partly for political reasons. Actually, this programme, because of Pakistan's poor track record, is highly conditional, and those conditions are front-loaded. So before each tranche of IMF money is dispersed, various indicators have to be met. So I think it is significant that they are now within touching distance of completing that programme, and I think that has led to a platform for the economy to do much better. I mean, again, there are challenges, but I think if you look at the recent material from the IMF, I think are portraying the country accurately. The government is beginning to get the tax take up, and I think the ability of the government to collect taxes in return for doing a better job in providing public services to the people of Pakistan is fundamental to its long-term prospects. And secondly, I think there is a willingness to carry on pressing ahead with some of the tougher things that the economy needs, including structural reforms and privatisation. So, for example, privatisation of the state airline PIA, which is a massive drain on the exchequer, was very controversial earlier in the year, led to violent protests and a lot of controversy with the opposition in Parliament. But actually, the government's found a way through that and is pressing ahead with a soft launch of a 49% stake in the airline this month, which I think says to me there is still a political will to move ahead with the difficult economic reforms the country needs. So again, I think the economy has moved into a more positive place. Fourth area, and I think this is perhaps the area where it's a little harder to be completely optimistic, but again, I think at a minimum things aren't as bad as they might have been. A lot of people's fears have not been realised, is Pakistan's relations with her neighbours. And just to sort of have a canter around them in no particular order, starting with Iran. I mean, the big problem in that relationship was clearly Iran's position internationally and sanctions and the nuclear issue. Now, the fact that there's now an agreement which means that Iran is moving back into the international fold, that sanctions are progressively being lifted, does mean there's a big opportunity for an improvement in the Iran-Pakistan relationship in the commercial field. That the Iran-Pakistan gas pipeline, which I think is win-win for the two countries because Pakistan desperately needs the energy, can be restarted, having been put on hold by Pakistan because of those sanctions, does mean there's a new opportunity. And I think the other thing I'd say is I think Pakistan has been relatively successful in navigating the tension between Saudi Arabia and Gulf states, Pakistan's traditional allies, and Iran. So, for example, Pakistan did not join the military coalition taking action against Yemen, and in the aftermath of the execution of Sheikh Nimr al-Nimr, they were, through a bit of shuffle diplomacy, able to avoid being seen overtly to take sides in that dispute, and they have therefore, I think, managed quite a difficult and delicate balancing act. Although I think clearly there are causes of tension with Iran. There are border issues. There are issues over Iran's relationship with India, and there's a degree of competition in their approaches to Afghanistan. In terms of Afghanistan itself, I think the truth is that 2014 and the end of the President Karzai's period, things had reached a nadir. There were then, as always, high and probably overinflated expectations of how things might improve. And when President Ghani came in, he reached out to Pakistan in what was quite a brave way in terms of Afghan politics, but that was also reciprocated by Pakistan, by both the military and also the civilian leadership. But that hasn't yet delivered a really fundamental change in that relationship. Although I think there are some signs, despite recent news of border clashes, there are some signs that things are changing. I think some of the fundamentals are shifting in a way which gives me a little bit of optimism that they can move on to a more positive trajectory. So I think there's now much more of a sense that cross-border terrorism is a shared problem, because the truth is, the last couple of years we have seen significant attacks into Pakistan from Afghanistan. So this is no longer a problem which is basically Pakistan into Afghanistan. It is actually now a two-way problem. So there's a shared problem there in terms of how you manage the border in a way which avoids or minimises the risk of terrorism in either direction. Secondly, I think there's a renewed emphasis on regional connectivity, where again, I think there are some mutually beneficial projects. So CASA 1000 is a thing people always talk about, but there's some revenue streams there for Afghanistan, and there's some energy at the end of it for Pakistan, which again they desperately need. And although it hasn't actually worked, at least for now, I think if you look at the cooperation between Afghanistan and Pakistan since December of last year over an Afghan peace process, it is actually unprecedented. So Afghanistan and Pakistan sitting down with China and the United States and agreeing a roadmap for how to try and get a peace process going between the Afghan government and the Afghan Taliban is a first. It's not happened before. So while I'm not, it wasn't sufficient to bring the Taliban to the table, and I think the relationship is already coming under stress this summer. I think that will carry on with high levels of violence in Afghanistan. I think there is the prospect of a better relationship going forward, and I think you have on both sides leaderships who do want, but are constrained and have different perspectives, do want a better relationship. So I don't think it's hopeless. Thirdly, and perhaps the biggest elephant in the room, India. There's no, as you all know, formal dialogue at the moment. But I think when I look at the way in which both countries reacted to the attack on the Air Force base in Pathankot in January, I think actually they both did so in quite a mature way. So for India's part, the Indian government's part, there was not an immediate allegation that the Pakistani state or parts of the state were behind the attack. And on Pakistan's part, there wasn't what sometimes you see in the past, a defensive crouch and a pulling down of the shutters, and no recognition that Pakistan had anything to do with it. In fact, there was a recognition that the people involved had come from Pakistan, and quite a thick dialogue and channel between the national security advisors on both sides in terms of the way in which the immediate aftermath was managed, including, I think, again, unprecedentedly, Indian government allowing a Pakistani investigation team to go across to India to look at the attack, and that says to me that both sides want to try and find a way back into dialogue if they can. I think that is the underlying reason for the way in which they chose to manage the aftermath of that attack. Now, they haven't actually managed to do that yet, and I think there are some worrying signs in Pakistan that India is becoming more. You see an increase in anti-Indian rhetoric over the last year, probably in Pakistan, and having had elections in 2013 where there wasn't about India, it was about energy, electricity, governments, governance and that sort of thing. I think there is a risk now that India becomes more of a political issue within Pakistan over the next few years, and that would be unfortunate in terms of the 2018 elections. But I do think, although they have differing views of how to do it, and of course there are big hurdles about how you would stage manage, I do think there's a desire on both sides to try and find a way back into dialogue of some sort, although that is challenging. Finally, and I talked about big elephants, but this obviously is the biggest, China. Clearly I think the big new development over the last 2 years in terms of China and Pakistan is the famous China-Pakistan economic corridor, I mean, from my perspective, if there is significant investment in Pakistan's infrastructure that helps with the country's stability and prosperity, that is something which should be welcomed. And the proposed scale of this investment is significant, and it does meet a desperate need in Pakistan for energy. And it's also true that Pakistan would not be able to get the sorts of sums being mentioned elsewhere in the world. It wouldn't have been able to raise that money on international capital markets. I think for me the questions are around, firstly, the sheer ability of Pakistan to actually deliver projects of that scale in the timeframes envisaged. I mean, this would challenge any country's honest truth. I mean, we don't in the UK have a fantastic track record of delivering major infrastructure projects, and these are big projects, and it is just simply in project managed terms going to be difficult to deliver them. But secondly, also I think importantly, how Pakistan ensures that what it's getting is value for money, having not gone to international markets to raise the capital, in the sense that it's getting a good deal. But I do think it has the potential to make a significant difference to Pakistan's future. So, from my perspective, I think those four areas, moving on to a more positive trajectory, has given people in Pakistan, people who think about Pakistan, more time and space not to think about the immediate problems, not to worry about whether the country is going to go into a full-blown crisis next week or next month or possibly even next year, and more time therefore to step back and think about the country's longer-term challenges, which are significant. And I want to sort of highlight four areas which I think are the country's biggest challenges looking forward. I mean, the first is demographics. Third of the population under 14, 60% under 25. Now, got right, if these young people can be provided with, firstly, a good education, and secondly, a job and economic opportunity, that can be a real strength, and it can be a benefit for the country. And I think there are signs that people in Pakistan are getting to grips with the issues, are thinking about how to deal with them, are even willing to talk about and discuss and try to come to some sort of consensus on contentious issues like family planning, where there was a big summit in Islamabad last year which brought together both religious and political leaders and did look at some of the more difficult issues. But demographics is going to be a big challenge, and how the young people of today are educated and given economic opportunity or not, I think will be a big factor in the country's long-term future. Second, and related, because it's partly driven by the size of the population, and something which tends to be forgotten given all the other problems the country faces, is climate change and access to water. So Pakistan is the 8th most impacted country in the world by climate change. In 2014, if you look at deaths from extreme weather, Pakistan was the 5th worst country in the world. And the truth is, as there has been more immediate things, people haven't really worked out long-term strategies to deal with that. And there needs to be obviously a global aspect, and you've seen that through the kind of global efforts, but there needs to be a regional aspect, in particular around water management, which is challenging because it brings in the relationship with India. And then clearly there needs to be a bigger national effort to build resilience and reduce vulnerability. But again, I think there is a long-term potential stress in Pakistan around climate and access to water. Thirdly, economic development. I mean, as I've said, the economy has stabilised, it is growing, but not enough. If you look at the population growth, you need to be growing at about 8% in a country like Pakistan just to keep up. So you need to reform the economy, you need to make it more productive and competitive, and that requires difficult structural reforms in the energy sector, in privatisation, and changing the balance of the way in which the state raises resources by getting tax up. And I think the risk is that we're 3 years into a 5-year electoral cycle. The IMF programme will be successfully completed, but the risk is that then you see a traditional boom funded by spending which can't be afforded in the run up to the next election, and actually you then just go back to where the country was. So I think there's there's an opportunity, as it were, to use where the country's got to as a platform to move on to much higher levels of growth, which I think the potential is there, but there's also a risk around the politics, which is, it's not unheard of in this country of, in a pre-electoral period, there being an increase in spending. And again, I think, there's an opportunity now to drive on or not. And thirdly, and again, this is something which is little talked about, but I think is actually very significant and probably hasn't yet played out, and we don't yet know really quite how it's going to play out in its entirety, is what I would describe as devolution. So the 18th Amendment to the Pakistan Constitution did some very important things around allowing a Prime Minister to do a third term, around removing the President's ability to remove Prime Minister from office. But one of the biggest things it actually did was devolving power very significantly from the federal level to provincial levels. And that has thrown up for me two issues. Firstly, I think the mechanisms within the state of Pakistan for how you have a federation coming together and resolving issues are immature. They're new, they're not very well tested. And I think there's a risk of tension there in how resources are allocated, in how the state manages a situation where some provinces are doing much better than others. And the other problem it's thrown up is that a lot of issues that were being dealt with at federal level, having been devolved to provincial level, there's a straight lack of capacity and capability to manage them at the provincial level. So I think there is a long-term challenge in a country the size of Pakistan, where devolution must be the right way to go, because you cannot manage a country of that size and complexity sensibly in a sort of unitarian way. It's how you actually build the ability of the state to manage devolution and the political tensions and challenges that throws up in an effective way. And again, I think that's a work in progress. So my conclusion, as I sort of left as High Commissioner and I've had a chance to reflect on, is 2015, if we're honest, is about the best year Pakistan has had for a long time. And I think it is worth saying that out loud. And I think democracy is deepening, security did get better, the economy is improving, and the regional relationships are not as bad as they might have been and have a prospect of being better. And I have spent a lot of my time in the British government thinking about Pakistan only through a kind of lens of crisis and challenge. And I think now there's a chance that you can see it as much through a lens of opportunity as threat. That said, clearly, the big risks, while reduced, are still there. The risk of political hiatus has not gone away. The risk of a full-blown crisis with India or with Afghanistan has not disappeared. Thirdly, as I said at the outset, I think there is, in my mind, therefore, when I look at sort of impressions of Pakistan, I think there is a disconnect between where the country is and where it might go and how it's seen. I think it's the job of Pakistan rather than outsiders to try and narrow that gap. But I think there is, and it is a problem for the countries. I think other countries are very effective at promoting themselves. I think while there's always going to be a lag as a country perhaps moves into a better place between how it's seen and how it's, I think there's a bigger lag than you'd normally expect. I think it's a challenge for Pakistan. But I think the final thing I'd say is that there is now, on the back of the improved trajectories I've described, I think there's an opportunity for the country, if you like, to put its foot on the accelerator, and I hope that's what happens. But if it doesn't happen, I think there are some big long-term problems out there which will come greater into the frame looking forwards.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philip, for that. Let me begin the discussion session by asking you the first question. Right at the beginning, you mentioned the strengthening of democracy and the deepening of democracy in Pakistan. But at the same time, do you think there is actually a weakening of the civil establishment and a strengthening of the army in the last few months, particularly? We've seen this, I think, through the success of Zarb-e-Azab operation, the tribal area that you mentioned, an operation that Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif was initially opposed to. We've seen this by the departure of President Musharraf, the former President of Pakistan, from Pakistan, which again Nawaz Sharif was opposed to. We've seen this again in terms of I think the failure for Nawaz Sharif to substantively improve relations with both India and Afghanistan, which he was inclined to. So, is there actually a concern now that what we are seeing is actually a weakening of the civilian establishment? I think perpetuated by the Panama Papers disclosure and the implications of that.
That's a good question. I think just to sort of disentangle a bit and perhaps look back. So in 2013, Nawaz Sharif, won a very strong mandate, an absolute majority, which I don't think people expected. So there's a new civilian government with a majority and a strong mandate, and you had a new army chief, General Al-Sharif, appointed, who was, if we're honest, was an unknown quantity. And you then had a period in 2014 where I think there was an expectation that the balance would shift more towards the civilian side than turned out to be the case. There were very serious tensions around, you mentioned General Musharraf, around the handling of General Musharraf and his trial. And there were then the street protests, although actually I think out of that democracy was strengthened. But I think if you look at what came out of that, and I think it is still the situation, through 2015, there was it wasn't a formal understanding, but I think there was a modus vivendi between the civilian side and the military side, and it wasn't black and white, and it wasn't that people said, you're doing this and we're doing that. But I think they did find a way of working together effectively, and I was very struck by two things. One in which, the way in which actually, on a very regular basis, the Prime Minister and the Chief of Army Staff with their closest advisors sat down and thrashed out issues. And secondly, the way in which civilian ministers at senior level would talk to me about him. I think in terms of the issues you mentioned, Rahul, I think on Afghanistan, actually, there was quite a joined-up approach by the civilian and military sides in terms of reaching out to President Ghani. I think you're right, India, I think there was more tension. I mean, Nawaz Sharif has a long history of being very forward-leaning in his desire to see rapprochement with India, and I think it's not a surprise if I say that the Pakistan military has had a more backward-leaning approach to that. So I think there was actually quite a stable military-civilian relationship through 2015 into this year. So where are we now? And I think clearly, as in any country, Prime Minister, faces a political challenge, through the Panama Papers. That has left him coupled, sadly, I hope he is now recovering with his own medical problems. Has left Nawaz Sharif in a weaker political position overall. Not just vis-a-vis the military, but overall in terms of the politics of the country and with the opposition. I think we'll have to see how, after Ramadan, when he returns to the country, how things play out. I think we're in a slightly false period at the moment where he's been away for medical reasons, and it's slightly hard to make hard judgments. I mean, the one other thing I'd say about the Panama Papers is, it is, I think, important to note that that issue has been dealt with through parliamentary means rather than through protests, which is in a sense how it should be when you have a political scandal. That there's going to be a committee of parliament that's going to look at it. So I think it is possible that out of this, Nawaz Sharif will be politically weaker overall, including with the military. But I think through most of 2015 and into this year, there was actually pretty good working relationship.
Thank you. There are several questions. If I'd be grateful if you could identify yourself before you ask a question or make a comment. But let me start with Dr. John Chipman, the Director General and Chief Executive of the IISS. John.
Well, thanks. One quick and one slightly longer question. The quick question is, on neighbours, is there any evidence at all of Iran animating or otherwise supporting the 12 Shia population in Pakistan, or is it the case that their natural desire to pull Pakistan away from a uniquely Saudi embrace in the Gulf moderates behavior in the country in that domain? And the second on China and Pakistan, obviously there's a very close strategic relationship. The Chinese have called it as close as lip and teeth, and Pakistanis typically refer to it as an all-weather relationship. There's a lot of concern in India about how the Gwadar port might actually have a military utility. How would you define the nature of the relationship today, and what could break that relationship?
So on Iran, John, I mean, the truth is it's opaque. So I can't say that there's hard evidence of Iranian stirring up of the Shia population. I think actually what we've seen is a pretty determined effort of the Pakistani system recognising the risk to them of not being seen to take sides and not through their own positioning, therefore making sectarian tensions worse. I couldn't give you a definitive answer on Iran. I'm sure there have, on occasions in the past, been some unfortunate Iranian relationships with sectarian groups on the Shia side in Pakistan, which won't have been helpful. I don't think that at the moment is significant. On China, I think for Pakistan, what does the Chinese relationship give you? I mean, they describe it as all weather. Firstly, it gives you a P5 cover. So, when an issue becomes a sort of global issue being looked at by the UN Security Council, whether that's a terrorism listing or whatever, China is Pakistan's all-weather friend and sticks up for you. And that, I think, is of fundamental importance to Pakistan. Secondly, what we're now seeing it doing is something, I think, new, which is giving it the potential for very significant investment in infrastructure. And I think over time, that will change. I mean, what might break it? I mean, I find it quite hard to see in the short to medium term something break it. I mean, the only thing I think could break it, but I just don't think this is foreseeable, is somebody providing an alternate top-level all-weather cover. And the only country there's only two countries who might do that. Is Russia or the United States, and I don't see either of those countries. There being a scenario where either of those countries would step into that role. So I find it quite hard to see the possibility of a break, to be quite honest, because I think Pakistan will always want that top-level cover internationally.
Victoria Schofield. Victoria.
Thank you, Tara Stephen. I just want to pick up, I mean, it's all very interesting, obviously, on your analysis of Afghanistan and Pakistan, no fundamental change. Can you sort of flesh that out a bit more? Because, of course, it's within this year that we've got confirmation that the Afghan, the Shura is the Afghan Taliban is in Quetta. And, of course, we know that the Pakistan Taliban operate from Afghanistan. So it seems until this thorny issue of both sponsoring each other's Taliban is addressed, there's no fundamental change is not going to make any improvement whatsoever with the relationship. And I saw President Ghani speaking at Lucy just recently, and it's beginning to wear thin, that optimism he had. He's put a lot of eggs in the Pakistan basket, and so far they haven't delivered.
I mean, what I would say, I think there are signs that things are changing. I think the fact that you had a situation where it was a one-way problem. It was basically terrorist attacks from Pakistan into Afghanistan. It's now a two-way problem. I think that does change the dynamic. Now the scale is obviously very, very different, but I think that does begin to change the dynamics because it gives Pakistan more of a shared interest in dealing with this because Pakistan is suffering some significant attacks through that. In terms of President Ghani, I mean, you're right. I mean, he reached out and he feels, I think, quite strongly that he hasn't had the reward that his politically difficult outreach to Pakistan might have delivered. But neither has he given up. And I think there is still the possibility of an improved relationship. I don't think either side has given up trying, to be quite honest, Victoria. And I think that will carry on. And I don't think, you say it's now clear that Quetta Shura is, I don't think there's anything new in that, to be quite honest.
Nothing new, but it is a thorn in both sides.
Sure.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I'm Mishrupa and I'm an instructor at Royal Military Academy Sandhurst here. Thank you for your talk. I've got two parts very quickly on the security perspective that you mentioned on the eastern and western side of Pakistan, which is India and Afghanistan. First of all, very quickly, India, you've very elaborately covered most of the aspects, and I didn't hear mentioning of the major issue of Kashmir, which Pakistan has fought 4 wars on. That's to start with. Having that thorn, again, using that word, in those relationships, where will the sincerity come from if a country has fought 4 wars and it's still there? That's the first part. On the Western side, the international community has not surged the number of troops there for a specific number of time, whereas Pakistan only on the border had more than 200,000 soldiers. My question is, where do you see, I mean, with that, the Pakistani side probably has a lot of insincerity seen from the international community where they've gone away, all the Afghani, whatever, terrorist Taliban, eventually now find a better place, like on the eastern side to live, come across it, create chaos, go back when they want to, and coming back to the same question there. On that security perspective, I think there's a lack of international sincerity which is seen in Pakistan. How do you see that with your time spent there?
To take the second question first, and I think we should acknowledge, and I certainly did when I was there, that the Pakistan military has done and is still doing a difficult, dangerous thing, and has taken significant casualties in doing that, which is going into some tough areas and inside Pakistan, so it's hard to do in your own country, and taking on terrorist and militant groups. And I think it's right we should acknowledge that. I think one can perhaps look back and talk about whether if this had been done earlier when there were more significant international forces in Afghanistan, the impacts you talked about in terms of there being space in Afghanistan might not have been there. If you look back in history, I think there were perhaps opportunities looked at from a Western perspective where Pakistan could have done what is being done now when there was more on the other side to avoid the kind of situation that we're now seeing, which I acknowledge and is a problem and is a challenge for the military operations, where people can go over the border and escape, as it were. That is difficult. On Kashmir, I mean, clearly, from Pakistan's perspective, you know this better than I do. That's one of the issues that you Pakistan want on the table in a resumption of dialogue with India. So, it's obviously a fundamental issue for Pakistan.
Is it not a legitimate? Sorry to come back. Is it not a legitimate? Because if it's not in the UN, if it is, it's different. Because the peace is.
So maybe after the discussion, there are several other people on the list, and let me take two people at any given time. Let me start with Bhupendra Jasani and Antoine. Bhupendra, if you identify yourself for the rest of the.
Bhupendra Jasani from King's College London. Recently, my former institute in Stockholm, SIPRI, made an assessment that Pakistan now has got more nuclear warheads than India. Coupled with that, China's non-support for India's membership to the nuclear suppliers group. How do you assess Pakistan's attitude? Will that change from what it is now, or will it become more aggressive? And second part of my question is, with the increasing terrorism within the country, how do you assess the security of the nuclear weapons in Pakistan?
Antoine, yes.
Thank you, Rahul. Thank you, Philip. I'd like to take us back to the China-Pakistan relationship. There have been reports in the last couple of months that DFID, the UK's aid arm, might be interested in collaborating with other multilateral donors to contribute towards CPEX. I wonder if you could talk a bit about that and tell us what the UK's interest would be in doing so. Thank you.
Perhaps I'll start with that question. I mean, I think DFID are funding part of the road infrastructure together with the Asian Development Bank. It is part of CPEC. The reason why DFID and, if you like, the UK government are doing that is for regional connectivity reasons and the boost this gives to trade and economic development on a regional basis. So that, if you like, is the headline justification. Stepping back in terms of kind of the UK attitude overall to CPEC, I think we welcome Chinese investment in infrastructure in this country, so it would be perverse for us to say we don't think China should be investing in infrastructure in Pakistan. So for me it's around what I said earlier, is it providing value for money? Is it helping produce a more stable and prosperous Pakistan, first and foremost in Pakistan's interest, but also in our interests? I think at the moment that's our view. So we don't have a hesitation in terms of supporting the overall concept of it. And I think actually, there may well be some commercial opportunities for British companies in terms of the services you need around this, not necessarily the sort of hard infrastructure, but in the kinds of professional services you need in bringing these projects to fruition. On the nuclear security, firstly, terrorism's decreased, as I said in my remarks, so your description of increasing terrorism isn't quite right. But in terms of nuclear security, my understanding is that Pakistan has pretty robust arrangements in place to ensure the security of their nuclear arsenal.
Let me take the next two, Gautam Sen and Colonel Zulfikar. Gautam.
Gautam Sen, DIPS Leicester. There were two opportunities in the past 50 years for the Indo-Pak relations to move forward. One was in 1954 when Muhammad Ali came to visit. He was offered a visit with the proviso of the Swedish administrator, which was rejected. And 1963 when Zulfikar Ali took him to visit Nehru. And he was told, settle while the old man is alive. After that, you will get back. It seems to me we now have a third opportunity because there's a huge commitment in India, from all that I can see, that there is need for peace for the next 30, 40 years for development. And we have an extremely pragmatic Prime Minister who I think would be politically able to deliver unlike almost anybody else. However, there's also a great danger, it seems to me, because of deepening Indo-US ties, and there are signs that India's debt of the Indo-US nuclear accord has been discharged. And the same degree of restraint which was exercised in the past decade is no longer in place. So there is also a danger that things could go wrong. And just a final comment, which I think most of my fellow countrymen will not agree with, I think it's time to legitimize Pakistan's position as a nuclear power, because that will bring greater stability to the system. What happened in the past, I think, is now over.
Let me turn to Colonel Zulfikar.
Yes, just again to question on both the East and West relationship, and also that what you mentioned about the perception lag of what things were in Pakistan and what the reality was, what the perception was. So first talking about the Western border, I think we've had an incident in the last few days where some border firing, some firing took place on the Afghan side in response to a gate being built by Pakistan on the Golkam highway, well within Pakistan territory. And Pakistan has now been saying this for the last 3 years. I was there in 2007. For 10 years, Pakistan has been consistently saying that this border needs to be sealed. And Pakistan has supported all efforts to seal the border. So that these allegations of cross-border movement or reality, whatever that may be, once and for all, that's settled. But it's quite surprising to note that neither the American nor the international community has ever endorsed these efforts. And in that sense, publicly, I'm saying publicly, sealing of the border, even this incident has taken place. We haven't seen condemnation coming from either the US or these capitals that this, we lost a major who was killed and 15 soldiers were injured in this fighting. So this gate was that what we said was we'll go for unilateral action to seal the border if the Afghans were supported. So that's the first thing, is that why this hasn't happened, why this Afghan resistance to the sealing of the border. That's the first. The second issue is about on the eastern side, and I think we'll hear you being High Commissioner to Pakistan. Even you have chosen to quote incidents. So only the Pathankot incident has been quoted. But you have not quoted the incident where a serving Indian intelligence agent from the Indian Navy was caught inside Pakistan recently for doing espionage. And here in the BBC report that the MQM leadership sitting inside London was actually being funded by the Indians. That is not me saying, it's the BBC who's saying that. And you don't see anything coming out either from the British government or the British community. So you do see a mismatch here. Because until you realize that there is a problem both sides of the border and you are ready to admit it publicly, this perception lag will always remain. Because no matter how much I say, unless you say that yes, there is a problem both sides, it will not go away. So what do you think is that?
The comment and the question.
Beautiful
question.
So, on your first point about the western border, I mean, the fundamental problem is it's not recognised by Afghanistan as a border, and so that is the backdrop, and that is the challenge. That's I know, but I mean let's be honest, that's the challenge, and because the security of that border matters. We've challenges. I mean, the received wisdom is that it's not physically possible for an Afghan president or government at the moment to recognise the Durand line as the international border, even if they wanted to. So you have to, I think, therefore take second best, as it were, and try and work out how Afghanistan and Pakistan can better manage that border to improve security in both countries. Now, for many years, and I suspect when you were there was a trilateral process for day-to-day management with ISAF, principally the United States, in the middle of that. And there were quite elaborate plans put into place for how that would become bilateral after 2014, which haven't worked out. And I think while, to answer your question of why no one says anything about it, I think while it's obviously Pakistan's right to seal the border, I think that the challenges and why people won't sort of come out is unilateral action, particularly along such a difficult border, isn't ever really going to be the complete answer. In the end, the answer is Afghanistan and Pakistan working out an effective way which works for both sides to manage that border, and I think that is the challenge going forwards. Secondly, on India, I mean, you're right. I did only mention Pathanchod, although I would simply say in my own defence, I did say in a positive light of showing that the reaction to it said something to me about both countries wanting dialogue. And I think what I would say to you is, it's a matter of scale, and if you look at the scale of allegations on the two sides, or actual provable things, there is a difference in scale. But I think it's also true that I think we probably need to be better at understanding what perceptions in Pakistan of Indian actions, true or false doesn't really matter, are genuinely felt perceptions and do drive Pakistan's policies, and that you have to understand that if you're going to have a sensible dialogue about those issues.
The next to Shashank Joshi and Kiran. Shashank.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to ask about the US-Pakistan relationship, which didn't come up very much, in light of the fact that of the first ever drone strike in Balochistan, the complications around the F-16 sale, the fact that almost every senior US official who has been in the Obama administration and come out has written in exceptionally critical terms about Pakistan, notably, of course, Hillary Clinton, but also many others, Pineto Gates. It seems this is the worst it's been since 2011. So what I want to ask is this the moment we have been looking back on since 2011, which is to say a more durable breach between the US and Pakistan, with US forces drawing down, less dependence on Pakistani supply lines, or are we going to look back on this as a blip in a few years' time?
Kiran.
Dr. Kiran Hassan Soas. My question is going to be an extension of Rahul's question, and it is much more looking into Pakistani domestic politics. Now, the thing is that, as you mentioned, that democracy is actually deepening in Pakistan, but with the current government, the third time elected Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, we've seen that he is not having been delivering at all on the domestic infrastructure and institutionally, and he's hugely unpopular. All the kind of recent quotes suggest that he is extremely unpopular with the domestic population. We saw that in the 2013 elections, the People's Party was voted out because of because of not providing or not delivering at a domestic level. Do you see that in future, futuristically, where is the Pakistani political civilian government or governments are standing? Because let's just leave aside the civil military dynamic on an international security dynamic, but on the kind of much more on the kind of domestically, if these politicians and civilian governments are going to continue to fail, where do you see democracy taking root?
So I'll come back to the US. So on domestic politics, so midterm prime minister is unpopular. I mean, shock, as it were. I mean, that's what happens to midterm prime ministers. So the key is, how does that unpopularity manifest itself in political terms? If that leads on to, street protest, unconstitutional change of government, which was the risk in 2014, then obviously that's a breakdown democracy. If it just leads to an unpopular prime minister losing the next election at the ballot box and someone else having a go, that is democracy. So I don't think we should exaggerate the fact that at the moment the prime minister is unpopular. At the beginning of 2015, people said to me, Nawaz Sharif won't last a year. And I thought, I'm not sure that's right. And it was completely wrong. When I left in February, people said to me, the PMLN are going to walk the next elections without any problem. Again, that turned out to be wrong as well, because no one knew the Panama Papers were coming. Clearly there is a political issue. But is this really going to lead to a hiatus or breakdown in Pakistani democracy? I've not seen that yet. That is not what I think is going to happen. You can't rule it out, because the democracy is not so entrenched that it's impossible. But I just don't think it's likely. I think the most likely thing is elections on schedule in 2018 and a genuine contest. You'll have three parties who will have a shot if they do their political jobs at having a share of power or winning power. PMLN, PTI, and a rejuvenated PPP. If they can do that. So that is politics and democracy. On the US, short answer is my instinct is it's a blip rather than a breach. And I think some simple indicators. No one's been chucked out of the country. That there's nothing has been, if you like, done to, in terms of to the US, which is irreversible. The fact that, the Special Representative Rick Olson was able to visit and was received. Yes, he was given robust Pakistani views, fine, but my instinct is we're talking about a blip rather than a breach.
The last three questions, because the questions sort of keep on multiplying, but let me start with Ijaz Hussain, and then the gentleman there, and then Desmond Bowen, and then Ijaz.
Dr. Ijaz Hussain, higher education developer. Now, I've got a unique background. I was the first staff officer as civil servant with Nawaz Sharif in 92. I was director of communication with Benazir Bhutto. I was in the cabinet of General Musharraf as media advisor and higher education advisor to Pervez Alai in the government of Punjab. So with that unique background, I've got diverse experience working with all these people. Having said that, Philip, in your capacity, did you do anything substantive to curb corruption in Pakistan? I can give you empirical evidence after we leave this August House that $20 million are being sent out of Pakistan every day. So $7.30 billion per year. DFID is contributing towards Pakistan's economy like 750 million pounds to 1 billion pounds every year. When the leaders, they come to the UK, I can tell you there are BBC reflections on that, and certain clips are there, video clips, that Nawaz Sharif is coming to see Justine Greening in his Bentley, driving his Bentley, and to beg $750 million pounds from Justine Greening. Justine Greening is coming on the other side on Ford Mondeo, 80,000 pounds. So a beggar is more richer than the giver. So keeping in that, isn't a very strong background. I'll give you full empirical evidence. SFO, is it not the case for SFO? You play your role. If you have some evidence, you spend 2 years and corruption is the main problem for Pakistan. No other problem is more strong than this one. So SFO, do you have any role to play to send cases to SFO?
The gentleman, yes, please.
Charles Vivian, a member of the Institute. Thank you very much for what I consider a really fine analysis of the pluses and minuses. And you mentioned as one of the minuses or the problems, the demographics and the economy. And you, I think, quite correctly identified education as a critical problem here. what or how confident are you that the present government, or indeed any government, will be able, A, to regulate sufficiently the madrasas, and secondly, to extend and improve the provision of education within the country?
Desmond, point.
Desmond Byrne, member of the Institute. So can I just ask you about Pakistan's reputation, and what I'm thinking about is their nuclear program, their military nuclear program, which is said to be minimum, but nonetheless provides for capability at the lower tactical end and the absolutely top end and long range. I mean, to what extent does that mar Pakistan's reputation in the wider world and make the wider world leery of Pakistan as a reliable partner?
2 minutes, Philip.
Okay, 2 minutes. Okay. So on corruption, and your direct question on SFO, SFO is independent from government. They are independent investigators and prosecutors who act outside of government. So it's not something where the government says go and do this. If there's evidence of crime, they will look into it. Is the short answer. But you talked about DFID programs. I mean, to be absolutely clear, DFID money is spent to deliver specific things, and the government and DFID have robust mechanisms for ensuring that those things are delivered and happen. And unlike the United States, for example, and a lot of other donors, the UK is still willing to put money through Pakistan government coffers, for example, in the government of Punjab, where it is sure that money will be used for the purposes it's intended, for example, education. But where that's not the case, for example, in Sindh, the government doesn't. So, I think your description isn't. I mean, corruption is a big problem. Don't get me wrong, but I don't think you should connect that to DFID's programs in the way that you have. On education, I think the honest answer is some and some. I mean, I think there are, on madrasas, I think the government is making a genuine effort to try to get to grips with what is a very difficult issue, and has started a relatively effective dialogue with the religious boards that run madrasas and look at that. So I think they are trying to get to grips with that, and they are also trying to build capacity both in the primary and secondary sectors, but also in the tertiary sector, to meet what is a growing thirst for better quality education. But that's not perfect, and I think it's going to be a very challenging area given just the straight numbers. And finally, Desmond, on nuclear, I mean, I think yes, it is a factor, but I think actually the biggest factor is security and terrorism. So I think in terms of Pakistan's image, I think nuclear is in the mix, but I don't think it's a really big factor, if I'm honest with you, in terms of the way the country is perceived.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Philip. We have to end the discussion now. I thought it was very useful, and you provided an excellent perspective and an overview on the subject. I think just in terms of the number and the quality of the questions that came, I thought, obviously there's very great interest in what you had to say. So thank you for that. And I'd like to request all of you to join me in thanking Philip for being here and speaking. Thank you.